The dead had learned his name, not in the way the living learned it, whispered in taverns, carved into wanted posts, passed between soldiers who'd faced him on some forgotten battlefield and lived to regret the encounter. The dead learned it the way winter learns to find the cracks in stone walls, slowly with absolute patience, with the cold certainty that time means nothing when you have eternity on your side. Somewhere beyond the ruins of the wall, in the vast gray silence of the true north, the Night King had turned his ancient eyes southward and fixed them on something that had never existed in the long history of his war against the living. Something that would not die. He had pressed his hand to the foreheads of lords and warriors and kings. He had watched life evacuate their eyes and something older and colder flood in to replace it. He had built his army across 10,000 years of patient accumulation, and not once, not in all that geological dark, had he encountered a creature whose body refused the transaction, whose flesh knit itself back together before the cold could take root, whose bones rang like a blacksmith's anvil when Valyrian steel found them and sparked off into the night. The Night King remembered that sound. He had been thinking about it ever since. South of that silence in the great gray fortress of Winterfell, Logan sat on a barrel in the courtyard and sharpened a knife that didn't need sharpening. It was something to do with his hands, something that wasn't thinking. He lived long enough to know that thinking too hard before a war just meant you had more material for the nightmares afterward, and he'd already accumulated a lifetime's worth of those. Several lifetimes, if he was being honest, which he generally wasn't. Westeros had a smell. He'd cataloged it thoroughly in the months since whatever cosmic accident had deposited him here instead of wherever he'd been going. It smelled like wood smoke and animal fat and unwashed wool and the particular mineral tang of old stone that had absorbed centuries of violence. It smelled underneath all of that like the Canadian wilderness in deep winter. Pine and ice and something vast and indifferent lurking just beyond the tree line. That part he almost liked. The rest of it, the politics, the scheming, the way every conversation felt like someone was reaching for a knife they hadn't decided whether to use yet, that part reminded him of every intelligence agency he'd ever worked for, which was not a compliment. He'd survived King's Landing's games. He'd survived the Dothraki who'd wanted to test his claws against their Iraq blades. He'd walked the length of the King's Road while ravens screamed overhead carrying descriptions of the metal-boned demon who bled and healed and bled again. He'd made it to Winterfell because Jon Snow had asked him to, and because in all the crowded chessboard of Westerosi power, Jon Snow was the only piece that didn't feel like it was trying to play him. The man himself appeared in the courtyard now, ghost padding silently at his heels. The direwolf had decided, it's somewhere around their second week of acquaintance, that Logan was acceptable company. Logan had decided the direwolf had better instincts than most people he'd met in 2 centuries of living. They had an understanding. Council starting, Jon said. He had the look of a man who'd been awake for 3 days and expected to be awake for 3 more. Daenerys wants you there. Daenerys wants a lot of things. Jon's mouth did something complicated that wasn't quite a smile. She does. Logan set the knife down and looked up at the walls of Winterfell, at the stark bannermen moving along the battlements, at the distant smudge of cook fires where the combined armies of the North and the Unsullied and the Dothraki were camped in a sprawl of tents that stretched farther than the castle's torches could illuminate. When somewhere out beyond the darkness, past the Wolf's Wood and the frozen fields, and the long road to the wall that no longer stood, the dead were walking. He'd smelled them. Days ago, when the wind came from the north, he'd caught something underneath the cold that made Ghost's hackles rise and his own claws itch in their housings. Not rot exactly. Winter preserved the dead rather than decaying them. It was more like the smell of old iron left in snow. The smell of something that had once been warm and wasn't anymore, and had stopped caring about the difference. He'd kept that information to himself, not because it wasn't useful, it was, but because the moment he shared it, the moment this war council understood exactly what his senses could detect at distance, he became a resource, a weapon to be aimed. In his experience, the step between valued asset and expendable tool was shorter than most people comfortable with power like to admit. He stood, rolled his shoulders until something cracked, and followed Jon Snow toward the Great Hall, where the living were about to argue about how to stay that way. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. Through the heavy doors, warmth hit him first. The concentrated heat of 100 bodies and a roaring hearth fighting the cold that pressed against every wall like something with intent. The smell hit him next. Sweat, tension, tallow candles. And underneath it all, the faint copper note of fear that no amount of warriors' discipline could fully suppress when men and women truly understood what was coming for them. The Dragon Queen was already there, standing at the head of the war table, with her silver hair catching the firelight, and her violet eyes moving across the map of Westeros like she was calculating losses she hadn't suffered yet. Tyrion stood at her shoulder. Ser Jorah. Varys in the corner, quiet as smoke. Sansa Stark near the hearth with her face composed into the particular northern stillness that Logan had learned meant she was angry and intended to do something about it. Arya somewhere in the shadows. He could hear her breathing, slow and controlled, the way a person breathed when they trained themselves not to be heard. Daenerys looked at Logan when he entered. Not the way people usually looked at him. The combination of fear and fascination that his presence generally produced in people who'd heard the stories. She looked at him the way she looked at her dragons, with the careful, calibrating gaze of someone deciding how much of this power she controlled and how much of it simply tolerated her proximity. "Good," she said. "Now we can begin." Logan pulled out a chair, sat down and looked at the map. The enemy markers had been placed far north, beyond the remains of the wall. There were a lot of them. There were going to be a lot more before this was done. The war table was a map of everything humanity had left to lose. Logan had seen maps like this before. Not this map, not these kingdoms, but the essential geometry of desperation was universal. You could swap out the castle markers for fire-based positions, the King's Road for a highway through a jungle, the wall for a demilitarized zone drawn by men who believed in the power of lines on paper to stop things that didn't read paper. The mathematics of last stands didn't change much across centuries or worlds. You had ground, you had bodies. You had time, which was always running out. You arranged what you had and you hoped the arrangement held long enough to matter. What Westeros had, Logan calculated in the first 10 minutes of the council, was not enough. The Dothraki ride on the flanks, Daenerys was saying, her finger tracing arcs across the map with the confident precision of someone who had never watched cavalry get swallowed by an enemy that didn't have the biological programming to be frightened of horses. Unsullied hold the center. The Northmen defend the gates. The dead don't break formation, Logan said. The room looked at him. He'd been quiet long enough that some of them had started processing him as furniture. The dangerous foreign thing that sat in the corner and didn't contribute. That was fine. He preferred being underestimated. It was a habit that had kept him breathing through situations that should have ended him. Cavalry works against enemies that fear being flanked, he continued, not looking up from the map. Fear requires self-preservation instinct. These things don't have one. You send the Dothraki in fast and hard, they'll cut through the first ranks, and then they'll be surrounded by dead men who don't get tired and don't fall back, and the horses will panic before the riders do. He looked up. Kerna, you'll lose your most mobile force in the first hour. Silence. The particular quality of silence that meant he was right, and nobody wanted to say so out loud because agreeing with the metal-boned outsider felt like ceding something. Daenerys' eyes hadn't moved from his face. You have experience commanding armies. I've been in enough of them to know what kills them. And what would you suggest? He almost smiled at that. Almost. Depth. You stop thinking about this as a battle you can win by hitting hard enough and start thinking about it as a battle of attrition. You need to survive long enough to find an opening. Every soldier the dead kill gets back up fighting for the other side. That means your effective fighting strength decreases faster than your casualties suggest. Every minute the battle continues, the math gets worse. Tyrion, who Logan had identified in the first week as the sharpest mind in any room he occupied, despite the heroic efforts of everyone around him to ignore that fact, leaned forward. Then what's the opening? The Night King. Logan set his finger on the northern edge of the map. Everything dead moves because he makes it move. He's not a general commanding an army. He's the brain the whole body runs on. You find him, you end him. You end all of it. Every other strategy is just buying time to make that happen. And who goes after the Night King? Jon asked. The room went quiet again in a different way. The way a room goes quiet when a question has an answer everyone knows and nobody wants to say. Logan said nothing. He learned enough about this world's particular brand of destiny to recognize when a conversation was circling something inevitable. Daenerys moved before the silence could solidify. I have dragons, she said, and the way she said it was not boasting. It was the careful, deliberate statement of someone placing their most valuable piece on the board. Drogon, Rhaegal, Viserion. 3 living dragons against an army of the dead. Whatever your tactical concerns about cavalry, a glance at Logan, not hostile. Something more considered than that. The heir is mine. The heir was yours, Logan said, until it wasn't. Her eyes sharpened, not anger. She was too controlled for immediate anger, something that would become anger later, once she turned it over and examined it. What do you know about Viserion? Enough. He held her gaze. But I know you lost him beyond the wall. I know what raised him back up isn't your fire. I know that when you look north, you're flying toward a version of your own child pointed at your face. He paused. I'm not saying that to hurt you. I'm saying it because you need to make your plans accounting for the possibility that when Drogon and Rhaegal face him, one of them hesitates. One moment of that hesitation, and you lose another. The silence that followed was the worst kind. The kind that confirmed something everyone in the room had been carefully not saying. Jon crossed to the map with the expression of a man walking toward a problem he intends to solve by standing very close to it. We've faced worse odds. Have you? Logan said, and he didn't mean it cruelly. But the truth had a cruelty built into its architecture that no delivery softened. In every battle you fought, the things killing you wanted something on the other side of survival. Land, power, revenge. Those things can be negotiated, disrupted, redirected. The dead don't want anything. They're not conquering Westeros. They're ending it. That's a different problem. Sansa Stark spoke from near the hearth, her voice level and precise. Then what do the living have that the dead don't? Logan looked across the war table at the assembled remnants of a civilization that had spent most of his time here trying to destroy itself and had somehow arrived, battered and suspicious and magnificently stubborn, at the edge of the abyss still more or less intact. Each other, he said, for whatever that's worth. It wasn't much of an answer. When but in a room full of people who'd spent years treating each other as enemies, it was the only honest thing left to say. Outside, the wind came from the north. Logan's nose found it through the stone walls and the wood smoke and the press of bodies. That cold iron smell, closer than it had been yesterday. They were coming faster than anyone knew. He kept that to himself too, for now. The night before the dead arrived, Winterfell stopped sleeping. It happened gradually, the way fear always spread through a camp. Not as panic, which was loud and containable, but as a quiet, systemic wakefulness that moved from tent to tent like a contagion with no visible vector. Logan felt it before he saw it. The particular shift in the collective breathing of 20,000 people, the way the usual nighttime sounds of a military encampment. Snoring, when the shuffle of sentries, horses settling, gave way to something more alert, more brittle. By the 3rd hour past midnight, the cook fires were all burning, and nobody was pretending to sleep anymore. He was on the walls when he caught it properly. The wind had been building for an hour, pushing down from the north with a steadiness that wasn't natural. Not the variable gust and retreat of ordinary weather, but something sustained and intentional, like a door being held open. And riding that wind underneath the ice and the pine and the vast mineral cold of the true north was the smell he'd been tracking for days. Closer now. Much closer. Tormund Giant's Bane found him on the battlements and stood beside him for a long moment, his red beard catching the torchlight. All his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the castle walls, with the hard-won vigilance of a man who'd lived his whole life north of sense and safety. "You smell them," Tormund said. It wasn't a question. "Since yesterday morning," Logan kept his eyes on the dark. "They move at night when they can. Cold's worse, visibility's worse for defenders. They've been doing this for a long time. They know what works. How far? Close enough that I'm up here instead of sleeping." He paused. "Close enough that you should wake Jon Snow." Tormund was gone before he finished the sentence. Logan appreciated that about him. The man processed information and acted on it without the intervening layer of ego management that slowed down most people in positions of authority. It was a rare quality in any world. He stayed on the wall. Below him, Winterfell began its slow, shuddering awakening. Torches multiplying, voices low and controlled. The rhythmic clank of soldiers moving to positions they'd been assigned and rehearsed and dreaded. He watched Unsullied form their defensive squares with mechanical precision, their rectangular shields locking into place with the quiet efficiency of men who had trained away everything that wasn't combat readiness. He watched the Dothraki mount up in the outer field, their horses already restless, already catching something in the air that the riders' human noses hadn't registered yet. He'd said his piece about the cavalry in the War Council. He hadn't said it again. You told people the truth, and then you respected their right to make their own catastrophic decisions. It was a philosophy he'd arrived at somewhere around his 3rd century of watching otherwise intelligent people ignore good advice in favor of the thing that felt like courage. Jon Snow came up the steps at a controlled run, Ghost at his heels, Ser Davos 2 paces behind. He reached the battlements and looked north into the dark, and his face did something Logan had come to recognize. A kind of settling, like a building completing its foundation work. Jon Snow was most himself when the situation was worst. It was his most genuinely admirable quality, and probably what was going to get him killed. "How long?" Jon asked. "Hour, maybe less." Logan tilted his head slightly, parsing the wind. "They're not marching anymore. They stopped about 20 minutes ago." "Stopped? Reorganizing." He glanced at Jon. "Or waiting for a signal." The signal came before Jon could respond to that. It started as a sound at the edge of hearing. Not quite sound, more like the memory of sound, a frequency that lived below the threshold of normal human perception. Logan felt it in his back teeth and in the titanium-reinforced architecture of his skeleton. A low harmonic vibration, like a massive string plucked somewhere out in the darkness. Ghost dropped to a crouch and bared his teeth at nothing visible. Along the walls, soldiers shifted and gripped weapons and looked at each other with eyes that had gone wide and honest. Then the temperature dropped. Not the ordinary cold of a northern night. Something absolute and immediate. 20 degrees in the span of a breath. The kind of cold that had weight and intention behind it. What that pressed against exposed skin and found the gaps in armor and clothing and settled there like it intended to stay. Several of the torches guttered. One went out. "They're here," Logan said. He said it quietly, to no one in particular, and the words were barely out of his mouth before the first of them appeared at the edge of the torchlight's reach. A single white, standing still at the perimeter of visibility, then another beside it, then more, filling in from both sides like a tide finding its level, until the darkness beyond Winterfell's walls was no longer darkness, but a mass of pale faces and dead eyes stretching as far as even Logan's enhanced vision could resolve. Tens of thousands, arranged in absolute silence, waiting. "Gods," Davos said very quietly. Logan pulled his claws. The triple sneak of adamantium clearing its housing was sharp and clean in the frozen air, and several of the soldiers nearest him flinched at the sound before catching themselves. He'd stopped apologizing for the effect it had on people. He looked at Jon. Jon looked at him. Between them passed the particular understanding of 2 people who had survived enough impossible situations to recognize another one and had independently decided that recognition wasn't going to stop them. "The dragons," Jon said, as if answering, a sound split the night from above. The massive, percussive crack of enormous wings. And then Drogon was overhead, black against the stars, and Rhaegal beside him. And the firelight caught the underside of their scales and painted the frozen ground below in flickering amber. The dead looked up. Their faces showed nothing. Whatever mechanism animated them had not included the capacity for awe. But somewhere out in that vast dark army, Logan knew something else was watching, something that had recognized him too. He dropped off the wall onto the outer rampart and started moving toward the gates, because the one thing he'd learned from 100 years of warfare was that waiting for the killing to come to you was a losing proposition. Tonight, he'd go to meet it. The long night did not begin with a charge. It began with a sound, that same sub-audible harmonic that Logan had felt in his teeth on the battlements, but amplified now, sustained, rolling across the frozen ground like a wave that had no intention of breaking. And then the dead moved. Not the ragged shambling that stories tended to assign to things that walked after death, but something coordinated and relentless and geometrically precise. A tide of bodies pressing forward with the patient hydraulic force of water, finding every weakness in a dam simultaneously. The Dothraki went first. Logan had known they would. He'd said what he had to say in the War Council, and he watched them ride out anyway. 10,000 screaming riders with araks raised and torches burning. Their war cries enormous in the frozen night. The thunder of hooves shaking the ground beneath Winterfell's walls. For 30 seconds, it was the most magnificent thing he'd seen in this world or any other. The Dothraki hit the front ranks of the dead like a wave hitting a cliff face, blades swinging, horses lunging, torchlight scattering across 1,000 dead faces. Then the torches went out, one after another, extinguished by a cold that had no natural explanation, until the darkness beyond the walls was absolute, and the sounds coming from it were no longer war cries. The Dothraki did not come back, not as Dothraki. Logan was already outside the walls when the gates opened for the Unsullied to advance, already working through the outer perimeter where the dead were thickest and the defenders thinnest. He moved differently in a real fight than he did in the carefully observed demonstrations he'd given Jon Snow's commanders during the preparation weeks. There was a version of Logan that was controlled and deliberate, that placed claws with surgical economy and conserved energy and maintained tactical awareness of the larger battlefield. That version existed. Then there was this. And the berserker state wasn't something he chose exactly. It was more accurate to say it chose him, rising up through the layers of discipline and restraint when the combat reached a certain pitch of intensity, burning away everything that wasn't immediate and physical and lethal. His claws found the dead with a rhythm that outpaced conscious thought. Whites came at him 3 and 4 at a time, and he moved through them the way a current moves through reeds, not fighting the resistance so much as redirecting it, using the press of bodies against itself, keeping moving because stillness was death even for a man who couldn't die easily. The cold was extraordinary. Every breath he pulled in felt like swallowing broken glass, and the healing factor was working constantly now. Not on wounds, which were minor, but on the frostbite that kept trying to take hold in his extremities and kept losing the argument with his biology. He could feel the adamantium in his skeleton conducting the cold inward, turning him briefly into something like a refrigerated filing cabinet, and he had to keep moving to generate enough internal heat to compensate. Around him, men were dying. He could hear it, the specific wet sounds of violence, cries cut short, the crash of a soldier going down in armor. Every man who fell rose again within minutes, joining the mass of dead pressing against Winterfell's walls. And the mathematics he described in the War Council were proving themselves in real time with brutal accuracy. The defending force was shrinking. The attacking force was growing. Every casualty was a transfer of resources from one side to the other. He tore through a cluster of whites that had cornered 3 Unsullied against the outer wall, his claws finding the cold gray matter at the base of each skull with the efficiency of long practice. And the 3 soldiers stared at him with eyes that had gone past fear into some region of experience that didn't have a name yet. He didn't stop to let them process it. He pointed back toward the gates and kept moving. The dead had a logic. He'd been mapping it since the fighting started, running the observations through the tactical part of his brain that kept operating even when everything else went animal. They were dense at the perimeter and thinner in the approaches, which meant the Night King was using the outer mass's pressure, pushing the defenders backward, compressing them, rather than committing his full force to a single breach point. Patient strategy, the strategy of something that had been doing this for 10,000 years and had never once been in a hurry. He fought his way back toward the gates and found Jon Snow in the middle of a cluster of dead men. Longclaw moving with the particular grace of Valyrian steel in hands that knew how to use it. Together they cut a corridor through the press, not speaking. The kind of functional wordless teamwork that only developed between people who'd been in enough bad situations together to stop wasting breath on communication that could be replaced by proximity and trust. "The Night King," Logan said between kills. "Not yet." Jon's blade swept through a white's neck with a sound like a cleaver finding frozen wood. "Bran says..." "I don't care what Bran says." Another cluster of dead, another 30 seconds of pure physical arithmetic. "He's out there. I can feel him." Jon looked at him sharply. "Feel him how?" Logan didn't have a clean answer to that. It had started 20 minutes into the battle. A pressure at the back of his skull that was different from combat awareness, different from the animal alertness of his senses at full extension. Something directional and specific. A point of attention in the vast dark beyond the walls, focused on him with an intensity that he recognized from a different register of experience entirely. He'd been hunted by extraordinary things across 200 years of living. He knew what it felt like to be the designated target. "He knows I'm here," Logan said. He's known since before the battle started. Above them, Drogon screamed across the sky and unleashed a torrent of fire that illuminated the battlefield for 3 terrible seconds. And in that light, Logan saw them, the dead in their thousands, pressing forward in silence. And at the rear of that vast army, still and pale against the darkness, mounted on a dead horse with ice-blue eyes burning in a face carved from the oldest cold in the world, the Night King, looking directly at him, not at Jon Snow, heir to Winterfell in the north, and every prophecy anyone had bothered to write down. Not at the dragons carving fire through his army. Not at the castle full of living people that represented everything his existence was designed to end. At Logan, the healing factor pulsed through him, hot and urgent, and his claws caught the firelight. And across the 1,000 yards of churning battle between them, something passed. Not communication exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement between two things that had existed far longer than everything around them, of a collision that had been inevitable since the moment Logan arrived in this world. The Night King raised one hand, slowly, with the patience of something that had never once needed to hurry, and the dead nearest Logan turned away from the walls and toward him, 1,000 bodies reorienting like a compass finding north, and began to advance. 1,000 dead men wanted him specifically, and Logan's first coherent thought was that this was, professionally speaking, familiar territory. His second thought was that 1,000 was a lot even for him. He didn't run. Running from the dead was a losing proposition on a battlefield this compressed. They didn't tire, they didn't lose the scent, and panic was contagious in ways that killed more soldiers than swords did. Instead, he moved laterally, pushing against the flow of the reorienting mass, using the spaces between bodies the way water found spaces between stones. Keeping his momentum because momentum was the only currency that mattered when the math was this bad. His claws worked constantly, not the careful precision strikes of the outer perimeter fighting, but something more industrial, clearing space, buying seconds, converting the nearest threats into obstacles for the ones behind them. Jon tried to follow. Logan cut him a look sharp enough to stop him mid-step. "Stay on the wall," Logan said. "They want me, not you. Arnie, use it." Jon Snow was not a man who defaulted easily to sending someone else into danger in his place. It was one of his better qualities, and occasionally one of his more inconvenient ones. He held for a long moment, Longclaw burning cold in the firelight, and something moved across his face that Logan recognized as the specific calculus of a commander, overriding the instinct of a man. "Don't die," Jon said. "Working on it." He pushed deeper into the press of dead men and let them close around him. This was the part nobody who hadn't lived it could properly understand about what his body was capable of. Not the claws, which were visible and dramatic and tended to dominate the impressions of people who'd watched him fight, but the healing factor operating at full capacity under sustained assault. It was not pleasant. Kinda nothing about it was pleasant. Each wound that opened and sealed itself was its own discrete event, a flash of intense heat chasing the cold edge of whatever made the wound. And at the density of contact he was currently sustaining, those events overlapped into something continuous and deeply unpleasant that he learned over decades to simply set aside and deal with later. Later being the operative word, later implying survival. The dead were not creative. That was the thing he'd identified in the first hour of fighting that gave him whatever slim margin he was operating on. They were responsive and they were coordinated, and they were utterly without hesitation or self-preservation. But the intelligence directing them, the Night King's cold geometric will, operated at a macro scale. It positioned forces. It directed pressure. What it couldn't do at this granularity of engagement was account for an opponent who ignored the rules that the intelligence had built its entire strategic framework around. You couldn't demoralize Logan. You couldn't exhaust him. You couldn't threaten him with death in any way that landlocked his decision-making the way it did for every other opponent on this battlefield. The Night King had pointed 1,000 dead men at him, expecting to bury him. And what he'd actually done was give Logan a quarter through his army with a clear, directional indicator of where the command node was located. He came out the other side of the mass into a space of terrible stillness. The battlefield noise didn't disappear. It was still there. The screaming and the steel and the dragon fire blooming orange against the clouds. But it receded, muffled by distance and the particular quality of cold that had accumulated out here beyond the main engagement. The ground was harder than it should have been. His breath came out in clouds that hung longer than physics suggested they should. The dead stood in loose formation around the perimeter of the space, facing inward, and none of them moved. The Night King was 30 yards away. He was taller than Logan had estimated from the walls. Not enormously so, but tall in a way that carried authority the way mountains carried it, as a simple consequence of mass and permanence. His armor was ice-formed in the shapes that armor took, but wasn't quite armor. His eyes were the particular blue of deep glacial water, lit from within by something that wasn't fire and wasn't life, but occupied the space those things usually occupied. Warny, his face was ancient in a way that had moved past the category of old into something geological. He had been here before Westeros had a name. He had been here before the people who would eventually name it had arrived. He looked at Logan with those burning eyes, and he did not reach for a weapon. He raised his hand instead. Not the commanding gesture he'd used to redirect his army, but something more deliberate, an offer or an experiment. Logan felt it before the hand completed its arc. A cold that was different from the ambient temperature of the battlefield, targeted and specific, flowing toward him with the intentional precision of something being directed rather than something simply existing. He'd been cold all night. This was something else. This was the cold that was the medium of the Night King's power. The cold that had touched the Stark boy in a dream and marked him, that had taken Viserion beyond the wall and returned him changed, that had converted 10,000 living soldiers into 10,000 dead ones across the long history of this creature's war against warmth and breath and heartbeat. It found him and it began its work, and it ran directly into the healing factor. The sensation was extraordinary. Not painful exactly, but enormous, like two tectonic forces meeting at a fault line. The Night King's cold pressed inward, seeking whatever it sought in the transition from living to dead, and Logan's biology pressed back with the blunt animal insistence of a body that had been refusing to cooperate with death for 150 years and had no intention of changing that policy now. He felt it in the marrow of his bones, the adamantium conducting the cold again, making him briefly a skeleton of ice, and then the healing factor flooded in behind it, hot and fierce and deeply, fundamentally stubborn. He stayed on his feet. The Night King's expression didn't change. That ancient face was not constructed for the display of surprise, but something shifted in those glacial eyes. The adjustment of a calculation encountering an unanticipated variable. He lowered his hand slowly. Logan popped his claws. The sound was very clean and very loud in the stillness. "Your move, pal," he said. The Night King looked at him for a long moment. The look of something that had measured every opponent it had ever faced against the absolute certainty of its own victory, and was now performing that calculation again with different numbers. Then, without any visible signal, the circle of dead surrounding them took one step inward, then another. Logan tracked them in his peripheral vision without taking his eyes off the Night King. 30 dead men, give or take. He could handle 30. He'd handled more than 30 in worse conditions on worse nights for worse reasons. What he couldn't handle, he realized in the same moment, was 30 dead men and whatever the Night King intended to do while they kept him occupied. Above the battlefield, in the darkness between the stars, something that had once been a dragon but wasn't anymore, turned its dead blue eyes downward toward Winterfell's walls, and the cold that lived in its chest in place of fire began to build toward release. Viserion's cold fire hit the eastern wall of Winterfell like a verdict. Not the orange gold of living dragon fire, which consumed and scattered and filled the air with the smell of things becoming ash. This was pale blue-white, the color of the deepest part of a glacier, and it didn't scatter. It held. It coated the ancient stone in a layer of ice that spread outward from the impact point with organic speed, crawling across the battlements and down the walls and across the defenders, who couldn't move fast enough, converting everything it touched into a perfect frozen record of its final moment. So 3 Northmen on the eastern rampart became statues between one breath and the next. A section of wall that had stood for 1,000 years cracked along its newly frozen grain and began to come apart. Logan heard it from inside the circle of dead men and made his decision in the same instant. He didn't go through them. He went under, dropping flat to the frozen ground in the half-second of the Night King's redirected attention. Rolling beneath the grasping hands of the nearest whites, coming up inside the circle's perimeter with his claws already working. He cleared a path in 8 seconds of concentrated violence that he would not remember clearly afterward, because the berserker state had the quality of burning away the recording function along with everything else. And then he was out and running, not away from the battle, but parallel to it, tracking the sound and the cold light glow of Viserion banking overhead for a second pass. The dragon was lower than it should have been. Logan filed that away and kept running. Drogon found Viserion before the second pass completed. A collision of living fire and dead cold that lit the sky above Winterfell, in colors that had no business existing simultaneously. Orange and blue-white strobing across the clouds in pulses that cast the battlefield below, in alternating warmth and terrible chill. The sound was immense. Dragon against dragon, brother against corrupted brother, and beneath it Daenerys' voice carrying across the chaos in High Valyrian. Not panicked, never panicked. I'm but stripped of everything except the absolute concentrated urgency of a rider trying to reach an animal through 30 feet of open air, and whatever the Night King had done to the bond between them. Logan reached the base of the eastern wall and found Daenerys already there. She'd come down from Drogon's back, voluntarily or otherwise, he couldn't tell in the chaos, and she was standing in the ice-crusted rubble of the collapsed wall section with Jorah Mormont beside her, and 4 Unsullied forming a perimeter, and her eyes tracking Viserion's movements overhead, with an expression that Logan had learned, in their weeks of difficult mutual assessment, meant she was operating beyond the range of her prepared contingencies and making decisions in real time from first principles. She looked at him when he arrived. Not with relief. Daenerys Targaryen did not do relief in public, but with the particular focused attention of someone instantly recalibrating their available resources. "The wall is breached," she said. "I can see that. Viserion is—" She stopped, started again. "He's targeting the castle, the crypts. If he gets through to where we have the civilians, how low can you get him?" She looked at him sharply. "What?" "Viserion." Logan was already tracking the dead dragon's flight path, mapping the arcs, calculating the geometry. He's flying lower than Drogon. Whatever the Night King did to him, it changed his instincts. He's not staying at altitude the way a living dragon would. He's coming in close. He looked at her. "Warn how low before he has to pull up to avoid the walls?" She understood immediately. That was the thing about Daenerys that cut through his general skepticism, about people who collected titles the way other people collected debts. She was genuinely fast. 40 feet, maybe less. If I can get up there, you cannot climb a dragon in flight. I can climb anything. He said it without particular emphasis because it was simply true. The question is whether I can do enough damage to the wing structure to bring him down somewhere. The fire doesn't finish what the Night King started. She looked at him for a long moment. Above them, Drogon screamed, and Viserion answered in that wrong, hollow register that made every living thing in earshot flinch back from some pre-rational recognition of wrongness. Her silver hair was wild in the thermal winds the dragons were generating, and her face was lit alternately by living fire and dead cold, and she looked, in that moment, like something that had stepped out of the same mythological register as everything else in this impossible world. If you damage his wings, she said carefully, and he comes down inside the walls, better inside than outside. Logan looked at the breach. Outside, he's the Night King's. Inside, he's just a very large problem we can work with. You're suggesting we crash my dragon into Winterfell. I'm suggesting we crash the Night King's dragon into Winterfell. There's a difference. Another scream from above. Viserion was banking again, the pale blue glow building in his chest for another pass. And Logan could see the trajectory. Not the eastern wall this time, but the courtyard, the great hall, the heart of the castle's defensive architecture. Daenerys made her decision the way she made all her decisions, completely without visible hesitation and with the quality of someone who had fully accepted the consequences before she announced the choice. Drogon, she said, not a shout, almost conversational. Dracarys! Drogon hit Viserion from above and to the left, driving him down and to the right, and in the 3 seconds of the dead dragon's destabilized flight path, Logan ran up the broken wall section and launched himself into 30 feet of frozen air. He caught the leading edge of Viserion's right wing with both sets of claws extended. The cold that flooded through the contact points was the worst thing he'd felt since the adamantium bonding process, which had been the worst thing he'd felt in his entire substantial life. The healing factor screamed into overdrive. He pulled with everything his enhanced musculature could generate against the membrane and the structure beneath it, and felt something give, not break. The Night King's modifications had made the wing architecture denser than living tissue, but tear, partially, enough. And then he was falling with the dragon, and the ground was coming up very fast, and he had time for one clear thought before impact. He'd survived worse landings. Viserion hit the courtyard, and the stone cracked beneath him, and the cold fire in his chest discharged in a pulse that coated everything within 20 feet in ice. Logan, already rolling clear, caught the edge of it, his left side encased briefly in a shell of blue-white ice that the healing factor dissolved from the inside out over the next 45 seconds of deeply unpleasant biological effort. He lay on the frozen courtyard stones and stared up at the sky where the battle was still happening without him and let his body conduct its repairs. Daenerys appeared above him, looking down with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated and more honest than gratitude. You walked out of Dragonfire, she said, in the Northfield 3 days ago, when Drogon... Yeah, I saw it. I thought... She stopped. You thought you'd imagined it. He sat up. His ribs had mostly sorted themselves out. You didn't. She was quiet for a moment, and watching him with those calculating violet eyes, and he could see the architecture of her certainty shifting. The woman who had survived fire, who had built her entire identity around the belief that her immunity to flame was unique, singular, the mark of her destiny, quietly restructuring itself around the fact of him. What are you? She asked, not cruelly, almost carefully. Logan got to his feet and looked at where Viserion lay thrashing in the courtyard, the damaged wing preventing flight, the Night King's animation keeping him from the stillness of true death. Complicated, he said. Deal with this first. The Night King walked through Winterfell's broken wall like he owned everything on the other side of it. No army preceded him, no Paradamans, no honor guard, no tactical screen of dead men to absorb whatever the defenders might throw at the approach. He came alone, or as close to alone as something that commanded 10,000 dead soldiers could be said to come. And the aloneness of it was more terrifying than any military formation Logan had faced tonight. It communicated something absolute, that the Night King had assessed everything Winterfell contained and determined that none of it required preparation. That he had come personally not because the situation demanded it, but because something specific had drawn him here, past the walls and the dying and the larger architecture of his ancient war, into the courtyard where Viserion thrashed against the damage Logan had done to his wing. He looked at the dragon briefly, then he looked at Logan. Or the courtyard had emptied fast. Soldiers developing the animal wisdom to evacuate a space when something walked into it that redefined the category of threat. Daenerys had not evacuated. She stood her ground with the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided a long time ago that retreating from frightening things was not compatible with who she intended to be. Jorah was beside her, his sword drawn in a gesture that was more loyalty than tactics. The Unsullied had pulled back to the courtyard's perimeter, their spears leveled, their faces doing the Unsullied thing of revealing nothing, while their eyes revealed everything. Logan stood between the Night King and Daenerys and did not move. The Night King stopped 10 feet away. Those glacial eyes moved across Logan with the patience of something that had been taking the measure of opponents since before recorded history and had never once been wrong about the outcome. Then he did something Logan hadn't anticipated. He reached into the ice-formed architecture of his armor and produced a shard, long, translucent, catching the firelight with the blue-white luminescence of everything he touched. Not a weapon exactly, or not only a weapon. He held it the way a craftsman held a tool he was deciding whether to use, and he looked at Logan with those burning eyes, and Logan understood with sudden cold clarity what he was looking at. An alternative to killing. The Night King had tried conversion at distance in the open field, and the healing factor had rejected it. What he was proposing now was something more direct, something that bypassed the biological argument between his power and Logan's body and went straight to the structural level. Adamantium, the metal that had defeated every conventional assault, every natural process of damage and decay that a century of violent living had thrown at it. The Night King was wondering, in whatever passed for wondering in that ancient architecture of cold intelligence, whether his ice could do what nothing else had managed, whether he could make something permanent out of Logan. Logan looked at the shard, looked at the Night King, felt the healing factor running hot and ready beneath his skin, like an engine that had been building to this for hours. "You've been watching me since before the battle started," Logan said. Not a question. Out of all of this, he gestured broadly at the courtyard, the castle, the ongoing catastrophe of the night. "This is because you wanted to look at something you couldn't figure out from a distance." The Night King said nothing. He hadn't spoken once in Logan's presence, and Logan had the impression he hadn't spoken to anyone in a very long time, possibly ever. Possibly because the category of living things he'd ever found worth speaking to had been empty until recently. "You can't turn me," Logan continued. "You tried it in the field and my body threw it back. Your thinking up close is different, more direct." He paused. "You might be right about that, but here's what I know that you don't." He let the silence sit for a moment. The Night King was still. Viserion had stopped thrashing, whether from exhaustion or some command from his master. Well, Logan couldn't tell. "I've had things done to my body that I didn't choose," Logan said. "Things that were supposed to make me into something specific. A weapon, a tool, something controllable." His claws were still extended, catching the firelight. "It didn't take, every time, and not because my body fought it off, though it did, but because there's something in here." He touched his chest briefly with one claw, a gesture that surprised him with its own sincerity. "That doesn't convert. Call it whatever you want. I've had 100 years to figure out what to call it, and I still haven't managed." Daenerys said his name quietly from behind him. A warning. The Night King moved, not toward Logan. Sideways, a step and a half. The economical repositioning of something that had been in enough confrontations to know that the value of a direct approach was sometimes precisely that it wasn't direct. His hand came up and the ice shard caught the light, and Logan was already moving when the cold hit him. Not the conversion cold this time, but something more focused and structural, directed at the adamantium itself, probing for whatever resonance the metal might share with the deep ice of the world's oldest winter. He felt it differently than before, not in his healing factor, but in his bones. A vibration at the molecular level, the Night King's power finding the frequency of the metal and pressing on it, not trying to cool it or coat it, but attempting something more fundamental, an attunement. The same process, Logan realized with a flash of tactical horror, and that had created the White Walkers from living men in the first place. Not conversion of flesh, conversion of whatever the self was made of beneath the flesh. His skeleton lit up with cold fire, and he dropped to one knee. The healing factor crashed against it like a wave against a seawall. Enormous, sustained, furious. His vision whited out briefly at the edges. He was aware of Daenerys moving, of Jorah shouting, of something large and fast crossing the courtyard from his left. Ghost, moving at full speed, with his teeth aimed at the Night King's arm, buying Logan 3 seconds of interrupted focus at the cost of a dire wolf that Logan was very much not willing to lose. Ghost! The Night King's attention shifted. The pressure on Logan's skeleton released by a fraction. Enough. He came back up off his knee with everything his body had left to give, closing the distance in a single motion, and drove 6 inches of adamantium into the gap between the Night King's ice armor plates. The contact was catastrophic in both directions. Cold flooded up his arm from the point of contact, the worst concentrated cold of the entire night, and the healing factor met it head-on in a biological argument that felt like shoving his hand into an industrial furnace. The Night King staggered, actually staggered 1 step back, the first disruption of that geological stillness Logan had managed to produce. And those burning eyes came down to the claws buried in his side, with something that was the closest thing to surprise the ancient face could apparently manage. Logan held the contact, and he gritted his teeth against the cold, trying to climb his arm toward his chest. Push the claws deeper. The Night King raised his hand, and the ice shard drove toward Logan's face. And then Drogon was overhead, a shadow blotting the stars, and living fire poured down into the courtyard with an intensity that forced even the Night King to move. Backward, through the breach in the wall, the ice shard dissolving in the heat, his composure reassembling itself with the dignity of something that did not run but was willing to accept that a strategic repositioning was occasionally appropriate. The fire washed over Logan. He stood in it and let it do its work on the cold climbing his arm, and the warmth was extraordinary. And the healing factor seized the opportunity with both hands. When the fire cleared, the Night King was gone. Viserion was still. Ghost was bleeding from a gash along his flank but moving, which meant alive, which was the only thing that mattered. Daenerys looked at Logan through the dissipating smoke with eyes that had added several new layers of complexity to their ongoing assessment of him. "You stabbed the Night King," she said. "Tried to." He examined his arm. The skin had mostly resolved itself. The cold was retreating. "Didn't finish it. No one has ever—" She stopped. He retreated. He repositioned. Logan watched the breach in the wall. He'll be back, and now he knows what close contact costs him. He looked at her. But he also knows what it cost me. Somewhere beyond the walls, in the vast dark machinery of the long night, something ancient and cold and patient was recalculating. How King's Landing smelled like it always had. Ambition rotting underneath perfume. The particular sweetness of a city that had learned to scent over its own corruption so thoroughly that the corruption had become the scent. Logan had ridden south alone. It wasn't a decision he'd announced or debated or submitted for anyone's approval. The morning after the Long Night's first assault on Winterfell, the battle had paused, the dead pulling back beyond the tree line in that patient hydraulic way. The Night King absorbing the night's information and recalculating. He'd found Jon Snow at the broken eastern wall, watching his people clear frozen bodies from the courtyard, and he'd told him simply that there was something that needed doing in the south, and that he'd be back before the dead moved again. Jon had looked at him for a long moment, with those gray eyes that carried more weight than any eyes had a right to carry, and had not tried to stop him. Daenerys had tried to stop him. That conversation had been shorter than she'd expected, and longer than he'd preferred, and it had ended with her looking at him the way people looked at weather. Something powerful and directionally uncertain that you could track but not redirect, and him walking to the stables without looking back. She'd sent no one after him. He'd half expected her to. The King's Road south was a different world from the frozen nightmare of the north. The cold thinned as he rode, the landscape softening from the iron gray of winter's full grip into something merely bleak and autumnal. And by the time the capital's towers appeared on the horizon, the air had the almost warmth of a place that had not yet fully understood what was coming for it. King's Landing always had that quality, a city so consumed by its own internal politics that external apocalypse tended to arrive as a surprise. Cersei Lannister received him in the throne room. Not the small council chamber, not a private audience room, not any of the dozen more intimate spaces a queen might use to conduct sensitive business. The throne room, with its towering ceilings and its walls lined with the skulls of dead dragons, and its ugly, magnificent centerpiece of melted swords, because Cersei had spent enough years performing power to understand that space was itself an argument. She wanted him to walk the length of that room and feel the weight of 1,000 years of Westerosi history pressing down from above before he reached the point where she was standing. It was a good play. He gave her credit for it as he walked. She looked better than he'd expected, which meant she looked exactly as she'd intended to look. Green dress, hair immaculate, the particular composure of a woman who had decided that the world burning down around her was not a sufficient reason to abandon presentation. The mountain stood behind her throne like a piece of furniture that could kill everyone in the room. Qyburn hovered at the periphery with his mild eyes and his mild smile, and his deeply unmild intelligence cataloging everything. "The man with metal bones," Cersei said. Her voice had that quality he'd encountered in a handful of people across his long life. The absolute flatness of someone who had cauterized every vulnerability so thoroughly that what remained was a surface nothing could find purchase on. "I've heard considerable stories. Most of them are probably true," Logan said. He stopped at the appropriate distance. Not deferential. He didn't do deferential, but not aggressive either. He was here to listen first. "You sent the raven." "I sent several ravens. You're the only one who came." A slight adjustment of her expression that wasn't quite a smile. "That tells me something. It tells you I'm curious." He looked around the throne room briefly. The dragon skulls in the walls, the torchlight, the absence of anyone who wasn't a Lannister asset. She'd cleared the room carefully. "And what are you offering?" "Sit down." "I'm fine standing." A pause. She recalibrated without showing the recalibration. "The North is losing," she said. "Not tonight, not this week, but in the arithmetic of the thing. I've had reports from my own sources at Winterfell. The dead that fall in battle rise again. The living who die in battle don't. Every engagement accelerates the imbalance." "I told them that in the War Council," Logan said. "They already know. Knowing and accepting are different competencies." She descended 2 steps from the throne's dais, which was a significant concession from Cersei Lannister, bringing herself physically closer to equal ground. He noted it. "Jon Snow won't surrender. Daenerys Targaryen won't surrender. They'll fight until there's nothing left to fight with, and then they'll die heroically and the songs will be lovely, and the dead will walk over their bodies into the rest of the world. And King's Landing. And King's Landing." Her green eyes were very steady. "I have the Golden Company. I have the fleet. I have resources neither of them would condescend to use, because using them requires accepting that some problems cannot be solved by heroism and dragonfire alone." She stopped 6 feet from him. This close, he could smell the careful architecture of her composure. Underneath the perfume and the certainty, something that was working very hard. "I have a proposal." Logan waited. "The North needs a weapon," Cersei said. "Not another army. Not another dragon. Something that cannot be killed, cannot be turned, and has demonstrated the ability to make the Night King bleed." She looked at him directly. "I need insurance. A guarantee that whatever emerges from the long night, Dragon Queen, King in the North, the dead, anyone, finds King's Landing too costly to challenge. You want me to fight your war after I finish the one up north. I want you to exist," she said with a precision that stopped him. "Simply to exist, and to be known to be here, in King's Landing, with my interests. Your presence is the weapon. You wouldn't have to fight anyone." A pause that was perfectly calibrated. "Probably." Logan looked at her for a long moment. He'd met people like Cersei Lannister before. Not many, but enough. People who had taken legitimate grief and legitimate intelligence and legitimate capability and alchemized them through years of survival in impossible circumstances into something that was no longer quite human in the way it processed other people. She wasn't lying to him. That was the thing that made her genuinely dangerous. She was offering him something real, something she actually had, and the terms were almost reasonable, and the thing she wasn't saying was what would make the whole arrangement monstrous. "What happens to the people in the North after the war?" he asked. "Your people, Golden Company, Fleet. What's the play when the dead are done?" Her expression didn't change. "Stability requires a single authority." "Yeah," he nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." "You've met Daenerys," Cersei said. "No, you've seen what she considers stability. Bend the knee or burn. The choice between my authority and hers is a choice between practical tyranny and ideological tyranny. At least mine doesn't come with dragons pointed at civilians." It was, Logan reflected, an extremely good argument. It was good in the specific way that the best bad arguments were good, constructed from true materials into a false shape, each individual piece legitimate and the overall architecture a lie. He'd spent 100 years watching people build exactly this kind of case for exactly this kind of choice. And the sophisticated version of it was always more dangerous than the crude version because it engaged the part of the brain that liked to be convinced. He thought about Jon Snow watching his people clear frozen bodies from a courtyard in the dark. He thought about Tormund on the wall in the cold. He thought about Ghost bleeding along his flank and still moving. He thought about Daenerys' face when she'd asked what he was, and how that question, unlike most questions people asked him, hadn't contained an agenda. "Here's my counter," Logan said. "You send the Golden Company north, all of it. You commit your fleet to supply lines for the northern armies. You fight this war like it's yours too, because it is, whether you're admitting that yet or not." He held her gaze. "You do that, I'll tell everyone you did. Songs, stories, whatever passes for reputation management in this world. Cersei Lannister, who saved the realm. That's worth more long-term than whatever you're planning." She looked at him with those flat green eyes, and he could see the calculation happening behind them. And all the variables and contingencies and long-game considerations moving like pieces on a board. "And if I decline your counter," she asked, "then I go back north and fight the war without you," he said. "And if we win, the people who win are going to remember who sat in King's Landing while they were dying." He paused. "And if we lose, none of this matters anyway." Cersei was quiet for a long moment. Outside the throne room's high windows, the sky over King's Landing was the deep blue of late afternoon sliding toward evening. And somewhere in that blue, Logan knew, ravens were flying north with information he hadn't given her permission to send. She was already 3 moves ahead. He'd expected nothing less. He rode back north with Cersei's answer folded inside his chest like a coal. Not warm exactly, but burning in the specific way that information burned when it changed the shape of everything around it. She hadn't said yes. She hadn't said no. She'd looked at him across 6 feet of throne room air with those green eyes running their calculations, and she'd said she would consider his counter-proposal, which in the language of Cersei Lannister meant she was going to do exactly what she'd planned to do before he arrived. And the conversation had been an intelligence-gathering exercise from the moment the Raven left Winterfell. He'd known it going in. He'd gone anyway because you didn't leave information on the table just because collecting it was unpleasant. And because there was a version of Cersei Lannister, smaller, buried under a great deal of accumulated damage, that had looked at him when he described the northern armies dying in the dark and had almost, for one unguarded second, looked like someone who remembered that she was supposed to care about that. He'd filed that away too. The cold hit him again somewhere north of the neck, the temperature dropping with the suddenness of a door opening, and with it came something that made Ghost, who had insisted on accompanying him south and had not been argued out of it, press close to his horse's flank and raise his great white head to test the wind. Logan pulled up and did the same, cataloging what the air was telling him. The dead had moved. Not the gradual hydraulic advance of the past days, something faster, more deliberate. The kind of movement that happened when a commander had finished processing the previous engagement and committed to a new approach. He could smell the cold iron signature of the army at distance. But the distance was wrong. They'd covered ground that should have taken another day at their established pace. The Night King was done being patient. He pushed his horse to a gallop and rode through the night. He arrived at Winterfell in the gray pre-dawn to find the castle in controlled crisis. Not panic. These people were past panic, but the compressed, urgent efficiency of a defensive force that had received bad news and was metabolizing it into action. Tormund met him at the gates with an expression that communicated several things simultaneously, and none of them good. They moved in the night, Tormund said. Fast. Scouts who went out didn't come back. A pause. The ones that came back weren't scouts anymore. How close? By nightfall. Logan dismounted and handed his horse off and walked fast toward the Great Hall. Jon Snow. War Council. Has been since the third hour. Tormund fell into step beside him. The Dragon Queen is, he searched for the word, determined. Inside the Great Hall, the War Council had the look of people who had been awake long enough that the concept of sleep had become abstract. Jon Snow stood at the map table with Davos and two of his northern lords. Daenerys stood across from him, Tyrion at her shoulder, and the conversation they were having had the quality of a conversation that had been running for hours and had stripped away all the diplomatic scaffolding down to the structural disagreement beneath. Ari cannot hold another assault at full strength, Jon was saying. Then we don't hold, Daenerys said. We strike. We know where he is now. We know he comes when... She stopped when Logan entered. Something moved across her face. Not relief, they'd established. She didn't do relief. But a realignment, like a calculation that had been running on incomplete data, suddenly receiving a missing variable. Cersei? She asked. Thinking about it, Logan said, which was the most generous interpretation of what Cersei was doing. He crossed to the map. Tell me what changed overnight, Tyrion told him. It was faster getting it from Tyrion. The man had the gift of compression, of delivering exactly the information required without the packaging of ego or fear that slowed most people's briefings down. The dead had advanced 12 hours ahead of their established timeline. The Night King's position had shifted. He was no longer at the army's rear in the command position he'd maintained throughout the campaign, but somewhere in the middle, embedded in the mass of his forces. Bran had attempted to locate him precisely and had encountered something that had pushed back against the attempt. The Night King actively obscuring his position, which he hadn't done before. He's learned, Logan said. From you, Daenerys said. Not an accusation, a statement. Yeah. He looked at the map. He knows direct confrontation with me costs him something he can't fully afford, so he's changing the geometry, putting distance and bodies between us, and making it harder to reach him before his army overwrites everything in the way. He traced the likely approach vectors with one finger. It's what I'd do. So we need to reach him before his army reaches us, Jon said. We need to reach him before nightfall, Logan said. In daylight, the dead are slower, less coordinated. Whatever the Night King's power draws on, darkness amplifies it. You've seen it. Every assault has been worse after sunset. He looked at Jon. We have one window, maybe 6 hours. The council absorbed this. Outside the Great Hall's narrow windows, the sky was lightening incrementally, the pre-dawn gray, resolving toward a pale and watery winter morning. I'll go in, Logan said. Through the army, same as last night, but with a specific destination this time, rather than a general engagement. He's embedded in the center. That's a known position now. I go straight through, find him, finish what I started in the courtyard. Through 10,000 dead men, Davos said. I've had worse commutes. You'll be cut off, Jon said. Completely surrounded. We can't. You're not supposed to come after me, Logan said. That's the point. He's expecting me to come with support, expecting you to commit your forces to covering my approach. If you do that, he routes around the engagement, uses your commitment against you, hits the castle from an undefended angle. He looked at Jon steadily. You hold the castle. Keep the dead off the walls. Give me time. Jon held his gaze for a long moment. And if you don't come back, then Bran's plan is your plan, Logan said. A Tronin and we find out which version of this story Westeros gets. Daenerys had been quiet through this exchange, which from her was always more significant than speech. She looked at Logan across the map table with those violet eyes that had been recalibrating him since Winterfell's courtyard, and she said, "I'm coming with you." The room shifted. Drogon can get us to the Night King's position faster than you can fight through on foot, she continued over the beginning of 3 simultaneous objections. He won't expose himself to dragonfire if he can avoid it. We saw that in the courtyard. It limits his options, and she looked at Logan directly, something deliberate in the look. I want to be there when it ends. Logan considered arguing, ran the tactical calculus. The dragon was a significant force multiplier in terms of approach speed and the Night King's reluctance to engage with it. The liability was the same it had always been. Daenerys on Dragonback was a target, and a dead Daenerys was a political catastrophe on top of a military one. The asset outweighed the liability if she stayed at altitude and didn't do anything characteristically decisive at the wrong moment, which was a meaningful if. You stay high, he said. Drogon keeps the army's attention while I move through. You don't come down unless I signal. And if you signal, come down like everything depends on it. She almost smiled. It was a near thing. I can do that. Jon Snow watched them reach this agreement with the expression of a man who had long ago made peace with the fact that the people around him made decisions he couldn't fully control and had learned to build his strategies around that truth rather than against it. He extended his hand to Logan, not the formal clasp of lords, but the grip of one soldier to another before an action they both understood might be the last one. Logan took it. Hold the walls, Logan said. Come back, Jon said. He walked out of the great hall into the cold morning air, and behind him he could hear Jon Snow beginning to redistribute what forces he had left into the positions that would need to hold against the full weight of the Long Night's army, and the sound of it, that controlled, determined, the undefeated reorganization, followed him across the courtyard to where Drogon waited, vast and dark and smelling of sulfur and something ancient. Daenerys was already mounted. He climbed up behind her, and the dragon's warmth came up through the scales to meet him, and the contrast with the cold he'd spent the night living in was so complete and so immediate that something in his chest loosened fractionally, some tension he hadn't fully acknowledged holding. Drogon launched without ceremony, the ground dropping away beneath them, and as they climbed, Logan looked out over Winterfell's walls at the landscape to the north. The dead forest, the frozen fields, and beyond them, the vast dark mass of the army that was already moving, already advancing in that patient hydraulic way, the long night walking south on 10,000 dead feet. Somewhere in the center of that mass, cold and patient and recalculating, the Night King was waiting. Logan popped his claws into the winter air. Time to finish the conversation they'd started in the courtyard. Drogon came in low over the dead army, like a black wound opening in the winter sky. The effect on the mass below was not fear, the dead didn't do fear, but something functionally similar, a ripple of redirected attention moving through the 10,000 bodies like wind moving through grain, every dead face tilting upward, every dead hand raising whatever weapon it carried toward the dragon's silhouette, which was exactly what Logan needed. 40,000 dead eyes looking up meant 40,000 dead eyes not looking at ground level. And at ground level, Logan was already gone. To drop from Drogon's back at the army's northern edge and moving through the press of bodies with everything his enhanced biology could generate. The daylight helped. Not enormously. The sky was the low, flat white of deep winter, the sun a suggestion behind cloud cover rather than a presence. But enough. The dead were slower, their coordination fractionally degraded. The Night King's command signal operating at reduced efficiency in whatever way the dark amplified, and the light diminished. Logan could feel the difference in the resistance. The bodies still came, still grasped and swung and pressed from every direction, but the seamless, geometric precision of the night assault was frayed at the edges, the responses a half-beat behind. He moved through them like he'd been doing it his whole life, which he essentially had. The army's center took 4 minutes to reach. He knew because he counted, the way he'd learned to count in firefights and jungle extractions and 100 other situations where time was the only currency that mattered, and you couldn't afford to lose track of it. 4 minutes of continuous engagement, of claws finding the specific point at the base of each skull that stopped the animation without requiring him to slow down enough for the surrounding mass to close completely. 4 minutes of the healing factor running hot and constant against the accumulating damage of 1,000 minor contacts with the cold that radiated off every dead body he moved through. He came out of the press into stillness. The Night King stood in a circle of his white walkers, 7 of them, the lieutenants of the Long Night, yet each one ancient and cold, and regarding Logan with those burning blue eyes as he emerged from the mass of their army, breathing hard and bleeding from a dozen places that were already closing. The circle was perhaps 30 feet across. The White Walkers were equidistant, positioned with the geometric precision of something that had been arranged rather than gathered. Logan had walked into a prepared position. He stopped, caught his breath, looked at the Night King in the center of the circle. "You moved early to get me here," Logan said. "Whole army advanced 12 hours ahead of schedule, changed your position, obscured yourself from the Greenseer." He scanned the circle of White Walkers. This was the plan, not Winterfell. Me. The Night King looked at him with those glacial eyes, and in them Logan read the confirmation. Not guilt, not triumph, just the simple acknowledgement of a fact. The way you looked at something you had built when someone finally understood what it was for. Above them, Drogon screamed across the sky, and Logan knew Daenerys could see the stillness below. The circle. The absence of movement that stood out against the churning mass like a hole in fabric. She was reading it. She was deciding. He didn't signal her. Not yet. The White Walkers moved inward. 1 step each, coordinated, closing the circle's diameter. Logan tracked them in his peripheral vision and kept his eyes on the Night King, because in every tactical situation he'd ever been in, the rule was the same. The most dangerous thing in the room deserved your primary attention regardless of what everything else was doing. The Night King raised both hands this time. Well, not the one-handed gesture of the courtyard, but something more committed, more total, and Logan felt it begin. Not in his flesh, but in the adamantium, that deep molecular vibration, the resonance the Night King had found in their courtyard confrontation and had spent the intervening hours refining. The metal in his skeleton lit up with cold fire from the inside, and the pain was extraordinary and immediate, and he went to one knee in the frozen ground and stayed there through will alone. The healing factor met it, crashed against it, held, barely. He drove his claws into the frozen earth and used them as anchors, and pushed back up to his feet through something that was not strength exactly, but was what strength became when everything else had burned away. The thing underneath capability, underneath training, underneath even the healing factor's biological stubbornness. The thing that was simply, irreducibly him. The Night King's eyes widened fractionally, the most expression Logan had seen on that ancient face. He crossed the 30 feet between them in 4 steps. The White Walkers converged from every direction simultaneously, and he moved through the first 2 with his claws before they'd completed the movement. Not stopping, not slowing, taking the impacts of the others against his back and his sides as the price of forward momentum, and paying it without hesitation, because the Night King was right there, and everything else was the cost of admission. He drove all 6 claws into the Night King's chest. The cold that came back up through the contact point was total and annihilating. Every cold he'd felt all night concentrated into a single channel, flooding up his arms toward his core with the force of something that had been building for 10,000 years. The healing factor screamed into response with everything it had. His vision went white. His skeleton sang with competing temperatures, the adamantium conducting both the Night King's cold and his own metabolic heat in a conflict that had no clean resolution, just 2 absolutes pressing against each other in the space his body occupied. The Night King put his hand on Logan's face. Not the ice shard, his hand. Direct contact, deliberate and total, and the cold that came through it was the source of everything. The original, undiluted will behind the Long Night, 10,000 years of accumulated purpose pressing directly against Logan's mind and his healing factor, and whatever the thing was underneath both of those that he'd described in the courtyard and still didn't have a word for. Logan felt it try to find purchase, felt it search through the adamantium in the regenerating cells in the century and a half of violent, stubborn living for somewhere to take root. He felt it fail. Not because his healing factor overcame it. The healing factor was at its absolute limit, burning with an intensity he hadn't felt since the Weapon X program had bonded metal to bone and nearly killed him in the process. It failed because what it was looking for, the space in a person where the self could be displaced, and where the warmth of living could be converted to the cold of the Night King's purpose, wasn't there. Not because it had been protected or fortified or supernaturally defended. Because Logan had spent 150 years getting it taken from him by everyone who'd ever decided he was a weapon to be aimed, and he had spent every one of those years taking it back, and there was nothing left to take. He pushed the claws deeper and twisted. The Night King made a sound, the first sound Logan had heard from him. Not a voice, nothing shaped like language, but something that came from underneath language, from whatever register the oldest things communicated in before the living had developed words. It was the sound of something structural failing. The White Walkers stopped moving, every one of them, simultaneously, as if a switch had been thrown. And then, one by one, they shattered. Not dramatically, not the explosive dissolution of something destroyed, but the quiet, complete fragmentation of something that had been held together by a will that was no longer holding. They came apart like ice sculptures in sudden warmth, falling into pieces that hit the frozen ground and were still. Outside the circle, the army stopped. 10,000 dead soldiers, all at once, standing motionless in the winter fields. No signal passed between them, no sound. The tide that had been pressing south simply stopped pressing, the hydraulic force of it evaporating as if it had never been, leaving 10,000 bodies standing in the postures of their last moment, like a frozen record of a battle that had just ended. Oh, the Night King looked at Logan with those burning eyes, and the burning in them was changing. Not going out, but shifting, becoming something else. Less like the cold fire of ancient purpose, and more like something that might have existed before the purpose did, before the first man was pressed into the first White Walker, before the long night had a name. Logan held his gaze and did not look away. Whatever passed between them in that moment, and something did, he would never find the words for it, not in any language he spoke, lasted 3 seconds. Then the Night King closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were not blue. He came apart the same way his lieutenants had, not with violence or sound, but with the quiet, complete resolution of something that had finally, after 10,000 years, been finished. The ice that formed his armor fell in pieces. The ancient face dissolved into winter air. And where he had been there was nothing. Not a body, not a remnant, just the cold and the silence, and the long white field stretching north to a wall that still stood broken and beyond it the true north. Empty now and enormous and somehow improbably still. Logan stood in the center of where the circle had been and let his claws retract and let the healing factor do its slow, thorough work on everything the night had cost him. Above him, Drogon circled twice and came down. Daenerys dropped from the saddle before the dragon had fully landed, crossing the frozen ground between them with a purpose that she didn't bother to disguise or perform. Just a person moving toward the place where something had happened that needed to be witnessed from close proximity. She looked at the ground where the Night King had stood. She looked at Logan. She did not ask if he was all right. She had enough battlefield experience to know that question was either obvious or unanswerable, and either way wasted breath. "It's over," she said. "This part," Logan said. She looked at him sharply. He met her gaze and she understood. Not what was coming, because neither of them knew exactly what was coming, but the shape of the understanding. That the long night was ended and Westeros still contained everything that had been wrong with it before the dead arrived. The wheel Daenerys wanted to break. In the wheel she might herself become. The 10,000 calculations Cersei was running in King's Landing right now receiving ravens that told her the army of the dead had fallen and beginning to process what that meant for her own position. All of it still waiting, all of it still unresolved. Around them, the dead army stood in motionless silence across the winter fields. 10,000 bodies that had been soldiers and small folk and lords and knights, standing in their last postures, no longer animated, no longer the Night King's instrument, simply the dead that they had always been, waiting for the living to decide what to do with them now. Logan looked north, into the enormous empty cold of the true north, out and breathed it in, the pine and the ice and the vast mineral silence of a place that had been the source of the world's greatest terror for 10,000 years, and was now simply a place again. Cold and large and indifferent in the way that wild places were indifferent, without malice, without purpose, just existing in the way that things existed before people arrived and started assigning meanings to them. He thought about the ravens Cersei had already sent. He thought about Jon Snow holding Winterfell's walls against an assault that had stopped in the middle of the night and left 10,000 standing dead as its monument. He thought about the Iron Throne sitting in its room of dragon skulls and the three separate people who believed they should sit on it, and the various catastrophes those beliefs were going to generate in the weeks ahead. He thought about Daenerys asking what he was, and how the question had contained no agenda. He still didn't have a clean answer. He'd had 150 years to work on one, and the best he'd managed was complicated, which was honest if not satisfying. Drogon lowered his great black head and regarded Logan with one enormous eye, and Logan looked back at him for a moment with the respectful acknowledgement of one large, dangerous thing for another. "We need to get back," Daenerys said. "Jon will be—" "Yeah." Logan turned from the north. Let's go." He climbed back up onto Drogon's back, and the dragon launched into the winter sky, and below them the fields fell away. The dead army standing in their final stillness, the broken wall in the distance, the long white road south toward a castle full of people who had survived something that shouldn't have been survivable, and were going to spend the rest of their lives figuring out what to do with that. Same as always. Same as every war he'd ever come out the other side of. The killing stopped, and then came the harder part. The part where the living had to decide what kind of living they were going to do. He'd been through it enough times to know it never got easier. He'd been through it enough times to keep showing up for it anyway. Winterfell appeared on the horizon, small and gray and standing, while smoke rising from its chimneys into the winter air, and Logan watched it grow larger as Drogon carried them south, and felt something that wasn't quite peace but lived in the same neighborhood. The particular quality of stillness that came not from the absence of problems, but from having done what could be done with this particular set of them. The rest was still coming. Cersei's ravens were already in the air. The wheel was still turning, and everyone who thought they could break it was still themselves capable of becoming it, including the silver-haired woman riding in front of him, whose dragons had helped save the world, and whose certainty about her right to rule it was the same certainty that had broken every king who'd sat the Iron Throne before her. He'd have things to say about that. He generally did. But for now, the castle was ahead, and the dead were still, and the long night was over, and Logan let himself have the moment for exactly what it was. Not an ending, because nothing in a life as long as is ever ended cleanly, but a pause, a breath between what had been and whatever came next. In King's Landing, a queen read a raven's message and smiled and began to plan. In Winterfell's courtyard, a white direwolf raised his head to the sound of wings and waited. And in the winter sky above the fields, where the dead stood in their final stillness, a man who could not die carried the weight of a world that kept finding new reasons to need him, and looked south toward whatever Westeros had left to become. He'd seen enough of history to know it was never finished. He'd lived long enough to keep showing up anyway. The Night King's fall did not announce itself with thunder or ceremony. The long night simply ended, the way all long things eventually did, not with the dramatic collapse of a single moment, but with the quiet accumulation of consequences finally reaching their resolution. Westeros woke to find its great terror concluded and discovered, as civilizations always did, that surviving the apocalypse was the easy part. What came after required a different kind of courage entirely. Jon Snow stood at Winterfell's broken wall and looked at the stillness in the northern fields, and understood that the war for the living had been won, and the war among the living was about to begin in earnest. Daenerys Targaryen returned from the battlefield with something new in her eyes. Not doubt exactly, but the beginning of a question about what certainty cost and who paid for it. Cersei Lannister moved her pieces with the smooth efficiency of someone who had never stopped playing a game that everyone else had temporarily forgotten. And somewhere in all of it, a man with metal bones and a century and a half of accumulated damage walked Winterfell's restored walls in the gray morning and looked at the horizon and understood that this world, like every world he'd been part of, still had considerable use for something that wouldn't stay down. The wheel kept turning, the shadows kept moving, and Logan kept walking toward them, because that was the only thing he'd